All right, guys, yesterday we took a look at a Latin Europe in the High Middle Ages by examining a number of different characteristics of the region at the time here. And so hopefully you're able to check out all 12, not only to make observations and summaries, but then also be able to categorize and analyze them as well. So we're going to go through each one and each set together. The first one we're going to take a look at is, in other words, a transformation from a feudalism and really the re-urbanization of Western Europe and the growth of cities, or what are known as the burghs. Okay. Burghs were kind of known as walled enclosures, and eventually many of these will become towns and be connecting towns both for overland trade routes and also for overseas as well. And this is going to differ from, and you see from a number of the slides, the manor system, where the film talked about this is an age of feudal certainty, right? You are one class, the nobles are another, and you're stuck there in this way. And that's been there for generations upon generations. And the change that we start to get, especially with the Black Death, is the decline of feudalism and the growth of these cities and these towns as well. Okay, there is shifting demographics. People are moving into the cities more and more so. And not only that, but one of the really important groups that grows, because look, we're looking at a structure whereby there is a king, there's a lord, and there's everybody else. You kind of need that intermediary group, right? And that group happens to be individuals like merchants and bankers that are now living in the cities. And not only that, but they're aligning themselves with those who will call themselves kings. And the kings are going to generate alliances with them over many of the feudal lords that existed at this particular time. Okay. Furthermore, there's the redevelopment of markets and really the rebirth of long-distance trade. I mean, how do you think the Black Death spread so quickly in Europe in this case here? And so in this, we find the roots of early capitalism, of free market and free trade in many of these towns. Not only that, but we see the return of specialization. Merchants, artisan, and particularly women who end up in many of these cities, and they become craftsmen. A number of men become physicians, lawyers, government bureaucrats who work for the king. And not only that, but the development of these groups called guilds, basically work communities. So if you're a specialist, for instance, you're a blacksmith or you're a tanner or whatever, or even doctor, or we'll see later on, professors, university professors, they have a specialty that they on one hand want to pass on, but on the other hand, they want to be able to keep within either their family lines or to people that they trust or think they have a certain skill. And so they're going to band together to form an economic community where they can basically set prices. So if you want, let's say, for example, a suit of armor created, you're really stuck. You can go to all of these different armorers, but they're part of the same guild and they're going to offer the same price in this case. So they're going to work together. This isn't free market by any means here, but is a means of economic control. And some of these guilds are so powerful that they will rival the power of a number of states and kingdoms. So that's the first one, the shift from feudalism to the growth and the rebirth of cities in Western Europe. Okay. The second one, deals with the Catholic Church and its institutions, and particularly we see the Gothic cathedral that develops over time, and we see a number of different characteristics with the cathedral. The Gothic term comes from the arches that you see that are in the picture there. There are also these foundations known as flying buttresses, so these elements right here on the left-hand side, whereby you have basically pieces that extend out so that you can actually support the building as they're building up and up, because again, these are built across generations as well. So these number of flying buttresses, large stained glass windows as well, which become a key characteristic of these cathedrals. A technology from China, the mechanical clocks, and not only that, but they are big, they are enormous. If you ever sat under a dome before, it really expands out the space. If you've got a house that has a vaulted ceiling, you kind of get that sense where the house feels bigger than the size really is. And so in this case, cathedrals like the Strasbourg Cathedral and others really give the sense that you're reaching to the heavens, and it shows not always the power of the Catholic Church and the resources that it is able to generate in doing this. in doing so as well. So this is Notre Dame in Paris, as well, another one of those cathedrals that really are world known in these cases. Now, we had mentioned before, and a question to bring up is, what are the consequences of the plague as a result in regards to the church? And so think about all those things. So come back to the film that we watched and the activities that we did, and sort out how groups like the Flagellants and others will not only weaken the institution of the Catholic Church itself. Another key thing to note is what is known as the monastic movement as well. And this goes all the way back to the 4th and 5th century, of those who wanted to seclude themselves out and so that they can have some sort of spiritual journey, what are known as ascetics, basically people who were going to deprive themselves for the sake of a spiritual experience and to be closer to God, in essence. And so the monastic movement grows enormously, and you see in the map the growth of the number of these monasteries that in some ways not only become powerful feudal institutions. They start to own a lot of land as well, but they become points of exchange and trade because pilgrims are going to, on their way to see relics, and others will end up at these monasteries as well. And so the monastic movement becomes another key player that in some ways works with the Catholic Church and sometimes really, really independent of the Catholic Church as well. Okay. The third set is Gutenberg's printing press in the 15th century. And this itself is revolutionary. So you have technology that is coming from China, particularly movable type, new ink from the Middle East, and you add that to Gutenberg's printing press, all of a sudden now you see the expansion of literature in so many different areas and texts and so forth. And so it ranges from people that we saw in the film, Giovanni Boccaccio, Edward Chaucer, and these are some of the key literary pieces, and particularly of dark humor that deals with the awfulness of the Black Death as well. We have the controversy over the printing and the reprinting of the Bible in this case. Can you take the Bible either in Latin, Greek, or Hebrew and transform it and translate it into the vernacular, into English, German, for the ordinary peasant to be able to read for himself or herself? And so this is going to lead to major controversies. You're going to have people people like William Tyndale, who print the Bible in English, and he's executed for it. And so this becomes a really controversial subject here. There are other developments in what becomes known as humanist texts, and so you start to see the rebirth of the logic and reason that comes about from the ancient Greeks, and it's expressed in a number of works by people like Dante and Erasmus and others, where they are going to start to look at the world and see how it functions as is, and be able to develop texts on their own. Then there's another branch known as scholasticism, highlighted by Thomas Aquinas, and this particular subset of literature is about trying to merge together faith, basically religion and science together, and so so that they may not have to contradict in these cases here. But what we get with the printing press is also development of academic guilds, and these academic guilds in a sense become universities. And so again, the guilds are basically trying to form some sort of means by which they say, look, I know all these things, I understand all these things, and I have this document, this degree that shows and demonstrates that I am a master of a subject or a doctor of a particular subject. And so as a result of this, you have these guilds in ways becoming the modern universities as such. And so they are going to wear things. If you look at the bottom left-hand side here, that square hat that you would wear at the graduations as such as well. So that's Gutenberg's printing press. Fourthly, what we start to see is a challenge from a number of feudal lords, not just in Spain, but predominantly in Spain, of the reconquest of a Muslim-held territory in Al-Andalusia. And so just as a reminder, this is an area in Spain that was controlled by the Muslim Moors, and a place of really diverse culture. Again, we talk about things like the jizya, right, that allows for different groups to live in harmony. And so this is a region where Arab, Berbers, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Germanic peoples, Romans came together to form a really diverse community. And by starting in the 8th and 9th and 10th centuries, a number of Spanish kingdoms in Castile and Aragon, these kingdoms are going to sound familiar eventually, will start to retake much of the Iberian Peninsula, but not only there, but then also in places in the Mediterranean like Sicily, and a number of other islands in the Mediterranean as well. Okay. One of the key consequences, and you kind of see that from, there's an image of a migration of people, is the persecution of Jews, often known as pogroms, that will result in the execution of a number, but then mostly Jews either having to convert or fleeing. And for them, it's just not the greatest situation, because if they're told to convert, and they're often seen as traitors, or their livelihood is co-opted by the fact that they were a Jew at some point, and they're just being Christian for the sake of earning money or doing something to that extent, or they leave for home. And so not the greatest situation. But what we do get is a unified Spanish kingdom and others under and heavily influenced by the Catholic Church. There's a real joining between the Spanish monarchy and the Catholic Church as a result of the Reconquista, the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. Fifthly, we have the slow deforestation of Europe, and you see that from the Roman times, the Roman Empire, and by the 11th century, a number of lords realizing that their economy is based upon pacifying domains and putting them under farming, under agriculture, and so they start to clear off a number of lands. They start to dig ponds where they put fish in, and they start to establish a number of towns as well. But environmentally, there is a dramatic change in the deforestation of Europe at this time. But for the feudal lords, this is a time where they can generate a little bit more revenue, especially as they start to be contested by many of these local kings. Slide 6. Is an instance from the early documents at hand here is the Magna Carta in England. And so the Magna Carta is one of the early, you could say, forms of document law that gets revived at this particular time. And so nobles forced King John of England to sign this charter, which basically says the king does not have full absolute right over the entire kingdom. And so the result of which is King John now must work with the nobles in an institution called Parliament in order to do things like raise taxes, to fight wars, and so forth. And so what we start to see the development of are two things. One, what we call constitutionalism, that there is a law and a legal system that is written down, or it's been decided and passed through a number of judicial decisions, that this is the way that law functions, not under the notion that a ruler makes all the decisions and so forth. And so the result of which are a number of a really extensive set of laws, not just laws, but again, judicial decisions made by judges, local magistrates, and so forth. And so it creates this really rich legal tradition that exists in England, and eventually will spread to other parts that England will colonize as well. 7 is the new medieval arms. And so by the 10th, 11th century, the medieval world is dominated by the lords, right? This warrior class with their own code called chivalry, and others, and basically armed with the horse and the lance and the sword and a full suit of armor and a lifetime of training, the lords and the knights, and many of them are now landowners in the old feudal system, really control most of Europe, and that's why we have this decentralized feudal system. But what we start to see is technology that will break the monopoly of the armored knight. Okay? Weapons like the English longbow, for instance, the French crossbow, and then eventually firearms as well. All of which, now the longbow takes a world of training, but longbowmen can actually fire at a really fast rate. Crossbowmen fire a lot slower, and you can train anybody to use the crossbow, and it packs a bigger punch than a longbow at a short distance. And then eventually, when you have firearms, same thing. You're able to train people who aren't training for an entire lifetime to be able to fight in these massed armies. And so the result of which is that the kings and their armed mercenaries, okay, will start to threaten the castles and the holdings of the feudal lords. And this is going to see eventually the rise of not just simply independent kingdoms, but also independent, we'll get to in the next unit, maritime kingdoms as well, that are nation states that are out sailing all across the world and eventually will colonize an immense part of the globe as well. And so all this in some of the new arms that are developed to break the monopoly of the armored knights and the strength of the castles and so forth. Slide 8 is the transformation of art from the simplicity of the Byzantine mosaics to the type of realism that is found in what becomes known as the Renaissance. And so you see work from all sorts of individuals, paintings from Leonardo and Raphael and a bunch of the others that are listed here in your work as well. So you may have recognized those names at a certain point here. But you see works like the Sistine Chapel. This is the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and it is pretty magnificent. That's actually my photo here. We weren't supposed to take pictures, but I took one, so that's actually mine as such. But either way, we see the use of new paints that are implemented here. But not only that, but much of this is being fostered by the Silk Road and Indian Ocean trade. Particularly in the Italian city-states, we have wealthy individuals who want to show, on one hand, not only their wealth, but then also their loyalty to the church or for penance for their sins, whatever it might be. And so they're going to start to sponsor particularly a lot of religious art that develops, and they become some of the key patrons of the art of the time period as well. So we see a drastic transformation of the arts. Okay. 9 is the development of mechanical power. Again, we're not quite at the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution is about power and where that's derived. And in this case, in the case of water wheels, either by animal or by, as noted, by water. And so you start to find ways that are much, much more efficient. The undershot and the overhead water wheels that implement the use of gravity as well. There's complex metalworking and woodworking that is developed. One of the big changes and one of the jobs that were in biggest demand were bell makers, because they were able to shape iron into these bells, and as they start to discover cannons, they realized, hey, it's these bell makers that can actually create cannons and so forth. And so the complex metalworking will allow for some of the technology that will take Europe really across the globe and conquering a good chunk of the globe as well. One of the key important parts in things like water wheels or windmills is that they take resources. And to build, you need a collaboration of people. And when you don't have large, powerful states like China or the Ottoman Empire, instead, you're going to need to band people together in order to say, look, we all have a little. If we come together, we can not only share the cost, but also share the risk as well. And so they start to develop things like windmills, printing presses, and so forth. And so the development of these commercial partnerships that, again, not only will band together, everybody's providing a few percentage, but if the whole enterprise collapses, then you're only going to lose a certain amount. And so the creation of things like joint stock companies and these commercial partnerships that reduce risk and allow for you to take at risk and to create like a trade mission out into the Atlantic or into the Mediterranean and so forth. Right? So mechanical power and the water wheel, but also the capital devices that come out from it as well. Okay. The 10th one is what is known as the three-field system. Okay. And so this is, in a lot of ways, a technology that comes from generation of experimentation. And so you have in a three-field system, sometimes four-field system, where you might grow a particular set of crops, grains, wheat, barley, and rye during the summer, and then something different that will replenish the nutrients, like peas, beans, oats. And so they'll use up different ones, they'll put different ones back in the soil, and then you might leave it fallow. So basically allow the animals to graze, okay, and basically do their thing. Natural fertilizer, in a sense. And so we see also new foods that are coming in from the Islamic world: spinach, artichoke, eggplant, citrus fruits as well from South Asia and Southeast Asia. And then finally, new technology, things like the use of the horse to the plow. And not only that, but what I call heavy horse collars that can dig further down. And if you dig further down, you can extract more nutrients out of the soil as well. And so new technologies will help for the population to recover from the decline in the fall of Rome to up to about 38 million, and double that up until 1340 when the Black Death starts to hit. But even then, there is real recovery, and you can't see it on the screen here, but there's real population recovery after the Black Death because of the three-field system and the efficiency by which agriculture is produced. 11, again, how the Black Death was able to expand so quickly is because this wasn't necessarily a dark age of communications. In fact, a lot of the road systems of the old Roman world was starting to come back a bit, but more particularly, there were a number of naval and maritime powers based upon trade in various regions. The first of which is the Italian city-states, which we've mentioned before, and many of which, by avoiding the traditional feudal structures, were able to build these powerful cities, Venice, Genoa, and others, ruled by these family aristocracies, and in some ways they're creating overseas empires and trade routes that lead through the Mediterranean and into the Black Sea itself here. And the Italian city-states in a lot of ways will become the focal point of European trade during this particular era. There's another one in the North Sea that is run by a group called the Hanseatic League. So we talked about the guilds before. This is in a lot of ways an expanded guild where they control monopoly on trade of goods that are developed in this area, things like wool and others that are shipped to other parts of the North Sea and eventually into the Mediterranean as well. Okay. And finally, we'll get to it in the next unit, the birth of these new maritime nation states: England, France, Portugal, and Spain, many of which are seeing the cost of traded goods where they want to avoid Italy and the Italian city-states because they're paying a lot more for these goods. And so they want to try to find a way to bypass them and all the middlemen, the Italian city-states, the Ottoman Empire, and so forth, leading eventually to exploration of the Atlantic as well. And then finally, this is in a lot of ways our conclusion here, the revived economic system, where it's not as if feudalism goes away and declines here, but you have in the top here, the feudal castle, the feudal lords and nobility, they don't go away. They are weakened by the Black Death, by the kings, but they're still around and they'll stay around for a long time. In this case here, you also have these powerful cities that develop as sort of mediators of the time, and also the expanders of European influence across not just the rest of Europe, but also into the Middle East as well, generating a number of merchant communities, bank investment, capital investments, and so forth. In many ways, making connections across Europe, and oftentimes initiating exchange by credit and debit for the first time, right? So, why bring a shipment of gold from all across the European continent? Instead, why not let's just have a sheet of paper, say, I owe you this, we do business every year, so let me create an IOU, creation of credit and debit for efficient exchange, which will eventually lead to the use of paper currency and other banknotes as well. You see the development of long-distance trade and those ships there, ships such as cogs, flutes, caravels that will take Europeans eventually again across the globe, the revitalized Roman road system, where you see the inn that's on the bottom left-hand part of the image, and then finally, all the guilds and the skilled craftsmen that are developing some of the technology that is going to be instrumental for European expansion eventually across the globe. And so therefore, the period after the Middle Ages are often called in really nice terms like the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the age of exploration, and also we'll get to the Protestant Reformation as well. But again, all of these are very much from the European perspective, because in a sense, scientific revolutions and renaissances have been happening all across the world, in China, in the Middle East, and we've been learning a lot about that in this case here. All right, so with that, go ahead and I hope that was helpful in understanding the rest of Latin Europe in terms of why it will become a key power to come in the next unit.